What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your AP World Historian, Ben Osborne, and World History teacher as well, I guess, right? I'm here on a Sunday morning, working hard for you guys. Got my coffee available here, as well as all kinds of other good stuff. I almost feel like I should start doing those ads like you get in like YouTube videos where they're like, oh, and this week we're sponsored by. So anyway, lame attempts at humor. Let's try it out, folks. So we're looking at Unit 5 now, um, which I'm really happy about. This can be a bit of a time suck unit just because there's a ton of stuff in it, but we're going to do our best to kind of move through it as quickly as possible and get you the information that you need. One of the biggest things here, of course, is that this is going to be stuff that'll be kind of all over the map, specifically with the revolutions, but we also need to talk a bit about the Enlightenment as well. This is really about like the big stuff that's changing, right? So 5.1 and 5.2 is about big political and sometimes social, but not always, but big political kind of changes. The rest of 5 is going to be mostly about the Industrial Revolution. So we'll be moving through these things kind of quick. It's important to remember to kind of like keep your focus on the big stuff. Like we're going to talk today about some Enlightenment thinkers, but it's not like you're going to need to specifically know everything about these Enlightenment speakers. So let's go ahead and get into it, okay? So Unit 5, Enlightenment and Political Revolutions. This will probably be a 2, maybe even 3-part series. We're going to do Enlightenment today, then we'll do Political Revolutions in the future. So, taking a look here at the Enlightenment, what the heck is it? What's being enlightened? The Enlightenment was a shift from superstition and community and a move towards reason and individualism. Remember, prior to this period, we're going to have a lot of sort of people's daily lives are ruled by little superstitions. Make sure you touch the doorway 4 times and hang the horseshoe or whatever, all that kind of stuff. And also that community, like individuals, are not as important as the power of the community. And we're going to see this change in this period towards more reasoned kind of information as well as individualism. The reason is not always correct, but the idea, at least, of reason is important. Okay. Ooh, check out my corgi. There's my corgi cup. When you have a corgi, you end up getting a bunch of corgi garbage. So there you go. All right, one of the things about the Enlightenment is that it's inspired by the scientific revolution. So essentially, what people are trying to do is they're trying to apply the concepts of the scientific revolution to human society, right? So the scientific revolution is all about things like astronomy and biology and stuff like this. And so some of these Enlightenment thinkers take a look at that and say, you know what, that idea of reason, that empiricism that Bacon is talking about, that is all stuff that we could apply maybe to human society. So progress is created by applying reason to natural laws, right? So this would be like if we're talking about modern day, this would very much be sort of in the progressive liberal kind of concept. Like again, don't associate these with modern day politics, but in the sense that like people who are maybe progressives or liberals in our society believe that we should advance constantly through these brand new ideas, right? These are the same kind of things that people are thinking here, that if there's a problem, we study it, we figure it out, and we apply laws and solutions to it to solve that problem, right? One of the things, though, that it does do is it minimizes religion in public life. So specifically superstition, religious faith, things like that are things that are going to be minimized a little bit by the group of Enlightenment thinkers because, as opposed to just having faith, they want to apply sort of their concept of reason to these things as well. This time period is known as the Age of Isms, due primarily to a lot of different philosophies that are created. So there's like socialism and Zionism and all these other kind of things. Enlightenment thinkers they looked at all parts of the world and tried to design ideas and systems to fix the problems they saw. One of these kind of things that's not exactly kind of laid out specifically, but is the idea of nationalism, right? That's kind of something that's going to come in this period as well, which is intense loyalty to your people, which is a little counterfactual in the sense of the Enlightenment because it's more about individualism, but it's, individualism to the nation instead. So how does the Enlightenment sort of work in a sense? Well, this is one example of sort of how it may work. This is a salon, okay? Our modern day word for a place you get your hair cut comes from a French word salon, which basically means like sort of the big room that you have in your house or like in a big fancy rich person's house. So here you see like there is a person who is showing off and talking about the latest in Enlightenment philosophies. They would invite their friends over and they would discuss these things. It's basically a big party where they talk about big ideas. That's the idea. And this is one of the specific ways that the Enlightenment will sort of spread and change over time. Now, this is going to be sort of a big list of Enlightenment thinkers. As I mentioned before, you don't have to have these like memorized, but it's good to know sort of the basics of them and to understand sort of where they come from. Remember, one of the biggest things here is really about political structures. That's like the biggest part of the Enlightenment, though there is some cultural and some other stuff as well. So a lot of these are going to deal with like questions of the government. So remember, we're in a world right now in the 1700s where mostly it's going to be monarchies. Some of those monarchies are going to be pretty dictatorial. You may have like a parliament or something, but that parliament is not all that powerful necessarily. So all these people are talking about different ways that we should view the government. So first off, we've talked about the Baconator before. That is Francis Bacon. He is one of these scientific revolution figures. So he is mentioned here again because his concept of empiricism is really what's going to really influence a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. So it's the idea that knowledge is what comes from your observed experience, right? That scientific experiments will sort of show us the way. So when we're looking at government, then we should experiment with government, according to the Enlightenment thinkers. Like, let's try a couple different things and see which ones work, or let's take a look at what has worked in other places and what has not worked in other places, and then we can try to do it from there. So, starting off very early on, we have these two gentlemen who are going to sort of contradict each other in some ways, but also support each other too. We got Thomas Hobbes. He released a book called Leviathan in 1651. He essentially is going to argue that human beings are really, really terrible. They are bad people, and we need a strong government to rule us to prevent anything bad from taking place. He also is going to come up with the concept of the social contract, that the government is where we sort of give up rights in order to be protected by the government. This is something we believe today to some degree. In America, for example, we do not have the right. Certain free speech can be curtailed. We can't threaten people, stuff like this, right? And in return for that, then our contract says that the government will help us with these problems. So if I agree to not threaten people or something, if somebody else threatens me, then I can get the police to come and do something for them instead. That is the basic idea of the social contract. Or things like we all pay taxes to make roads, stuff like that we have all that. But Hobbes is kind of a one way, basically, right? That the government, it basically just says do this and we're going to run things for you. John Locke then, a good 40 something years later, in two treatises on government, agreed about the social contract, but felt that the government owed us as well, right? So if the government was oppressive or bad, we have a right to overthrow it. That, of course, is going to be a huge factor for the American revolutionaries, who we'll talk about in our next video. A couple of images there for you. There's the Baconator on the left. Again, he is sort of a contemporary of Elizabeth and others, so he's got that sort of more old-fashioned look to him with his e-collar and so forth. These other guys then here, Hobbes up above you there and John Locke to the right, they are going to be more, more modern in a sense, like they're going to be wearing things slightly differently. So you can see Hobbes' little simple kind of collar thing there, and same thing also with John Locke. Also, he has quite a hawk face, right? Hawk nose. All right, continuing on then, we need to talk a bit about some French people, the philosophers, okay? It is not philosophes, it is philosophs is how you pronounce it, or philosophe. These are a group of writers and thinkers. They are primarily French, though they're not exclusively French. But they're going to look at new ways of thinking at the world. They will have a lot of these sort of French salons, specifically political, economic, and social issues are things that they're looking at. So some of the most famous ones here are going to be Baron Montesquieu. He will write a book called The Spirit of Laws in 1748. It was basically an essay on government. He admired and spoke well about the British system of checks and balances. And so he is the guy that's going to really kind of come up with this idea of the three branches. Are you getting where our founders got all their ideas from? Three branches of government. That sounds familiar, right? Followed up then by this guy Voltaire, who writes a lot of different things. His most famous work, though, is Candide in 1762. He is really a social commentator. He is not a political commentator. He's commentating on social issues, economic issues, things like that. Mostly, he's kind of like a Twitter troll from the 1760s, or something along those lines. Like, he is writing like funny, witty stuff. We today probably don't find it quite as funny and witty because we live in a different time, but at the time period, he was considered to be one of the foremost sort of, commentator on life. And so he would write these different little essays to kind of point out the absurdities of the situations that they were in. But one of the most important things about him is that he is going to advocate concepts of civil liberties in France. Like, oh my gosh, we have a monarchy and you're talking about civil liberties. This is the time period of, Louis the 16th and all that. They're still kind of in the sort of Sun King. He's not the Sun King, but in the Sun King kind of concept also. And one of the biggest things that he is going to do that we will kind of carry over to the American experiment is the ideas of religious freedom. So he is a big believer that people should be able to believe whatever they want. Like if they want to be, Baptists or Catholics or non-religious or Muslims or whatever, like, or Jewish people, like whatever it is they want. Those are things that people should be able to do. And again, that today strikes us as like, well, I mean, sure, but back then it was like, what? Like the idea that we would have these sort of ideas is crazy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau then will write The Social Contract in 1762. This will expand on the idea of the social contract. So specifically, he will kind of elaborate on this concept known as the general will of the population, that you should sort of like kind of get a basic idea of what everybody wants, and then the ruler should try to do those things. So if everybody is for kind of lower taxes or something like that, then the ruler should do the best that they can to try to carry that out in some way possible. Let's take a look at a couple of Voltaire quotes. Voltaire is like one of the most quotable people on the face of the earth, and some of his quotes are hilarious. Others of them are just kind of good in general. They're very much like Hot Topic T-shirt kind of quotes sometimes. So let's check it out. So here's a great Voltaire quote: "If you want to know who controls you, look at who you are not allowed to criticize." Oh, slam! I love it, Voltaire. I want that right on a T-shirt right here. How about this one? "Think for yourself and let others enjoy the privilege of doing so too." What? Voltaire, hold back, hold back. Your Twitter trolling is so good. So good. And then probably my favorite Voltaire quote, which is a little bit sacrilegious but cracks me up. Now, my good man, this is no time for making enemies." This was Voltaire on his deathbed when asked by a priest to renounce Satan. He, again, was very much a non-religious person during his life, kind of the classic definition of like an agnostic, basically, but that always kind of cracks me up. He's full of like witty little quotes like that over time. All right, just a few more here for us of Enlightenment thinkers. Adam Smith, we have talked about this guy before when we talked about mercantilism and capitalism. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations of 1776. He is going to oppose this concept of mercantilism. He's a big believer in free trade, the idea of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term which means sort of let it be, basically. So the idea that the government should just sort of let the economy do kind of what it wants over time. He also believed that government should reduce their influence on economic decisions. Now, this is something people mess up a lot. Like sometimes when they're, big believers in capitalism, they'll be like, "Oh, he thinks you should have no controls whatsoever over capitalism." But he never advocated for that. He believed that the government needed to have some impact on economic decisions, but it just needed to be very, very low, like the lowest possible. Like, again, he would be like a big advocate for like, child safety laws. Like you can't put glass in kids' food or something. Like he would be very fond of those kind of things in general. But the idea that the government should sort of be like, okay, you know what, we don't like Twitter or we don't like Facebook. We're shutting those down just because we feel like it, right? Like he would not be a fan of that. He would be a fan of sort of basic protections and things. And again, his concepts are going to be the basic foundation of modern day capitalism. Another guy here, Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason in 1794. This is the concept of deism. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some religion here for a second. This is kind of something that Voltaire would have been into. So there arose in this period the concept that God does not have as much like direct impact on us, right? So when you think about, well, today is actually the Super Bowl. You think sometimes about people who are like praying for the Kansas City Chiefs or whatever to win the Super Bowl, and you're like, I don't know if God has that much influence on things like football games, but people oftentimes will have a very specific idea of a God that helps us in like every single kind of ways. And if obviously if that's your faith, that's absolutely fine. But that is the belief that many people have. So this concept of deism is almost the opposite of that, right? Like it almost pushes against that idea. Essentially that God is not involved in the day-to-day of our lives, okay? That God essentially set the world in motion and that we need to figure it out to some degree. So in other words, we are created, we are born into this world, and God has set this world in motion. Here's how these things work. Here's animals for you to eat or whatever. Here's plants for you to eat. Here's products and stone and materials and all this kind of stuff for you to do whatever you want, human beings. Now enjoy it. I'm going to be out here instead, and when you're done with your life, you can come and see me. That kind of thing, right? The idea that oftentimes people use here is the concept of a watchmaker God. That God essentially created the world as like a watch that runs and ticks and does all this kind of stuff over time. you can see how this would very much be in line with the scientific revolution and the concepts of the Enlightenment. It's almost like the world is a puzzle that God has played out for us. So, if we can just figure it out, right? Like if we can figure out the scientific, patterns of things, or if we can figure out how human beings work, right, then we can make things so much better than we have right now. This concept is very popular with the founders. Again, I don't want to talk too much about controversial things or whatever, but there's a lot of people who have a belief that the founders were extremely religious, and some of them were. There definitely were some, but like Thomas Paine is one of our founders, and a lot of the other founders also, like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. They all were heavily influenced by this idea of deism. Like they kind of had some influence with this. They found it very interesting and entertaining, concepts or whatever. So like a lot of times when you see people refer to like Thomas Jefferson, or like in some of his writings, he talks about God or the Creator. Some of those things are really more along the lines of these deist concepts than like modern day concepts, right? Like modern day concepts of religion are going to be slightly different than this idea of deism. Now, there were certainly a ton of people at that time period who did have more modern ideas like faith and stuff like this, but this is a concept that is sometimes popular with a lot of different people even today. All right, and lastly, we need to make sure to get our ladies in there. We got Mary Wollstonecraft. So one of the biggest problems that people saw, in addition to the idea of like race, right? Like people were, a lot of people pointed out very early on that some of these Enlightenment thinkers own slaves and stuff, which is horrifying. So the idea that like you have these people in bondage and yet you're talking about liberty very much was not lost on people. Particularly, who was it? John Locke was sort of defending this concepts of race and slavery and so forth. But another kind of like contradiction that comes out here is like, well, what about women, right? Like a lot of these early writers, Locke and others, really were just like, well, women just don't apply. They're not, they don't need to be in this situation. Really kind of violating the very concepts that they brought up. The very concept that, hey, you know what, we should free everybody. We should look at empiricism and so forth. And then when women are like, yeah, we should look at empiricism. Why don't we look at this issue of women? They're like, that's silly. So people like Wollstonecraft are going to write a number of different treatises and so forth. So the most famous of these is The Vindication of the Rights of Women. It was published in 1792. She's an early feminist who's advocating for equal rights for men and women. Again, feminism at its most basic, like I think sometimes people think it's like women should be in charge or something, which not really. I mean, feminism is just the idea that men and women should be equal. So yeah, here we have an example of that where men and women are being advocated to be equal. But her ideas, of course, are not set in motion for quite a long time. All right, there we go. Adam Smith, he looks like the Quaker Oats man. I don't really know why that is, but that is the case. Over there on the right, then, we got Mary Wollstonecraft, who, again, very famous writer at the time as well as today. All right, let's take a look at some other Enlightenment ideals. These kind of concepts are some things that kind of like flow from it. So we have our initial ideas that we have the initial people writing books that are very specific, but then from those concepts we're going to have other things that emerge, and also sort of other ideological kind of concepts as well. So one of our big examples here would be conservatism versus classical liberalism. Now, this does not mean modern politics, okay? This is not Republicans, Democrats, right? Like these things are very different from what they are today than what they used to be. Words change over time. So in this case then, for example, conservatism simply means that it's a belief in traditional ideas. And at this time period, that means monarchy and none of these new ideological theories. Now, that concept of conservatism does hold till today as well. So for example, many conservatives think we shouldn't necessarily change things willy-nilly. We should keep things the same unless there's a good reason otherwise. But in this period, at least, those things that they did not want to change are monarchy, right? And some of the other concepts there. Now, on the other hand, then classical liberalism is going to advocate for natural rights, constitutional government, laissez-faire economics, right? So like, for example, a lot of modern conservatives would agree with these concepts because they have become the traditions, right? Like over time, the window has moved to the point where laissez-faire economics is not a conservative concept. I'm sorry, not a liberal concept. It is, maybe more of a conservative concept. Some liberals today would be more advocating what we're going to talk about in a second, depending on their circumstances. Britain was controlled by classical liberals in this period, and so we're going to see a lot of good parliamentary government, expansions of voting rights. So we'll talk later about like things like the Chartist movement and others that are going to try to get more and more people being able to vote in the House of Commons. Now, at the same time, then in this period, and this is going to be kind of near the end of this period when we have the Industrial Revolution, but over time, then we're also going to have the concept of socialism. which means that the means of production should be owned by the workers. In other words, you shouldn't have like factory owners that own all the money and just tell people what to do. Instead, factories should maybe be owned by individuals, well, collectively groups of individuals, like the workers themselves, and also that they would advocate for things like the government to do, like unemployment insurance or other stuff like that. This becomes very popular as a solution to the ills of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about in one of our next sections. A couple people who are famous for this at this time period, Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. These guys are going to be what are called Fabians. They believed in Fabian economics or Fabian socialism, which is that we should sort of really gradually move through it. So eventually, over time, we will see two different kind of like strains of socialism. There will be revolutionary socialism, where we should just overthrow the whole government. And then you'll also have these sort of Fabian socialists instead who say, well, we don't need to overthrow stuff so much. Let's just take our time and get there as we can. All right, and our last one here, a couple other Enlightenment influenced ideas then. Abolitionism, which sounds fantastic to me. So slave trade was banned in the early 1800s. So even America bans it, I think, was it 1812 or something like that? I forget exactly, but it's in the early periods there. But slavery itself is still legal in a lot of Europe and the Americas. So they refuse to allow importation of slavery, but not otherwise. This is a great example of sort of like people sort of doing things slowly, right? They're like, well, we need slaves, but boy, that slave trade is terrible, right? Like all those people dying and stuff, that Middle Passage is awful. Let's get rid of that, but let's keep slavery because I really like slavery a whole lot. So that's kind of what happens here. So what happens then is that abolition movements are going to seek to end this. So abolitionists are people who seek to end the slave trade. Now, most of these folks are going to try to work through political and parliamentary process. There are some who are going to advocate overthrow and like, slave rebellions and stuff as well. So one of the things that's interesting is that slavery's like continued existence depends a lot on how much the rulers needed it. So for example, Britain is going to ban it really pretty early because Britain does not have these big plantations, right? Most people in the country are small farmers. The small farmers do not want slavery. Like they don't want it because it undermines their ability to do anything. But Brazil, of course, needs all these slaves to keep producing all the sugar that their economy depends upon. So Brazil is one of the latest groups until like very, very late. So I think they actually banned slavery in the 1880s, so way after everybody else does. Serfdom was abolished in this period as well, though, with the exception of like Russia, which is like the dead last. But Britain in 1574, so way before this period. France in 1789, though most people were not serfs by this time. There's a very small amount of people who were serfs in this period. But Russia had serfs all the way up till 1861, and they had a lot of serfs. So the banning of serfdom is also going to be an interesting perspective. America is kind of a unique exception or interesting thing here for abolitionism, though, because a lot of these countries are very centrally organized, right? Like, so Britain or Germany has a central government and they control a lot of things. But of course, America has our sort of divided federalist system where the local states have influence, that kind of stuff. So in that situation for America, then it's complicated, and that's what leads to our Civil War, right? The northern part of our country does not have many slaves and is very much more along the lines of like England and places like that, whereas the South did have a lot of slaves, and they wanted to maintain their slave-owning aristocracy. So what they end up having then, of course, is that the country splits during the Civil War, or my favorite name for it, by the way, I found out the other day from W.E.B. Du Bois, is the Slaveholders Rebellion. I love that. So the Slaveholders Rebellion takes place in the 1860s because our system is divided like that. Like if we had a system that was different, like in Britain or somewhere, it may have never come to that because we would be much more centrally organized. So. Last one here. This is very much influenced by this idea of nationalism, but also the idea of individuals being able to sort of do what they want, as well as religious freedom. So there's a bunch of different Enlightenment ideals that are coming around this concept known as Zionism. Now, Zionism is, a little controversial today. There's different people who have different perspectives. Obviously, Jewish people and Muslim people have a little bit of disagreement over these questions. I really don't want to get into all those kind of things, but just to let you know that. But in the early period here, in the 1700s, 1800s, Zionism is the desire of Jews to establish an independent homeland. Specifically, they settle upon the Middle East. Now, for a while, there was all kinds of different discussions about where to do this. Like a lot of Zionists were trying to find like an island or a new space in Africa or all these different kind of things. So, for example, the Soviets in like the 1920s will establish a Jewish homeland way out in Siberia that nobody moves to. But that is an example of some of the different concepts. But the idea basically is that they want a place of their own. And so specifically, they come later on to believe in the Middle East as being one of the most important places. So this becomes an idea. People are pushing for it over time. We Jewish people need our own state, need our own place. And what happens then is that anti-Semitism across Europe kind of ebbs and flows over time. Anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe. We've talked before, for example, we just recently talked about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. We've talked before about Richard the Lionhearted kicking the Jews out of England. So it goes on for a long time, but it kind of ebbs and flows, right? So at the beginning of Zionism, it is at an ebb, so it's at a low point, but then it starts rising back up again. So, for example, others like Theodor Herzl and others are going to try to establish this homeland as they see anti-Semitism rising. And specifically, the Dreyfus Affair in France will do this. So, the Dreyfus Affair was essentially where a Jewish army officer in France ended up being accused essentially of betrayal. It's a long story as to what the specific details of it are, but he is accused of betrayal. But most people see it as an anti Semitic kind of pogrom almost, that he is basically a scapegoat. And it results in a lot of increased anti Semitism in France. And so when that's going on, then Herzl and others are like, we need to do something for ourselves. Like, we need to find a new place to go. And of course, that will not happen really until after World War II. But prior to World War II, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we're going to see Jewish people start to move a bit more back to that area that will become modern day Israel. So we are going to see a lot of groups moving that way over time. All right, we can see here just sort of in a brief picture sort of how that spreads over time and how that happens. So we have Israel in biblical times up there, then we have sort of the British mandate of Palestine, which will come later, and then the development of modern day Israel all the way through the 1970s when they are able to defeat Egypt and take control of part of the Sinai Peninsula. But we're going to get to that in like Unit 8, I think, or Unit 9, so that's going to be a little bit farther on for us, but the idea behind it at least is something that starts a lot earlier. All right, folks. I know this got to be a long video. Apologies about that. You can always put me on 2 times if you need to. Probably should have told you that at the beginning. But hopefully you got some good information here. We'll be looking at some of these political revolutions next time we get a chance. Thanks so much for listening. Y'all be great. Bye-bye.